Well, hello, everybody. Thank you for coming and thank you for being here. Today, we're going to talk about an exciting topic, and this is the basic principles of risk-based research for master gardeners. And this is a great topic because it will allow us to know, for example, when our research, the research that we are doing is valid, and when we can trust the information that we're provided to our master gardeners. So it's my pleasure to introduce Robert Sanchez, and he is a Colorado Master Gardener here in our county, in Douglas County. He graduated last year, so he was an apprentice in 2020. So it's kind of a exciting time as he was able to complete all his hours with the time, all the restrictions that we have last year. So I'm gonna go ahead and read a little bit about Robert, and he will tell us more in his presentation. But Robert was born and raised, and he's born and raised in New Mexico. He learned the appreciation for gardening from his mother, who was an avid gardener. He also learned the importance of being water-wise given the climate in New Mexico. Robert learned a Master of Arts from the University of New Mexico in Political Science in 1983. So he had a heavy background in the science, and he loved traveling as well as, and he has traveled to all the 7 continents. So that's quite exciting. Right now, Robert still works on the US Government Accountability Office, which is a non-partisan investigative arm of the US Congress, where he is a senior energy analyst, and his specialty is in nuclear energy. So he has kind of like a high-level radioactive wave type of exciting research. And as I mentioned before, Robert became a Master Gardener in 2020, and he also volunteers in the Audubon Society and always looks for opportunities to volunteer where both birds and plants come together, as they often do. So I'm very excited to present, and Robert gave a lot of thought for this presentation. So give it away, Robert. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Appreciate that. So welcome to the basic principles of risk-based research for master gardeners. This is going to be an interactive training exercise. So at any time, feel free to ask questions. I think we have the chat box and things like that that are open, and you can certainly ask a question. We also have opportunities at different modules that you can ask questions as well. So as Mari said, my name is Robert Sanchez, and I am a new Master Gardener. The Government Accountability Office publishes something called Government Auditing Standards. It's used by auditing institutions around the world. It's not used just for auditing, by the way. It's used for programmatic reviews and technical assistance by both the private sectors as well as government entities. And it provides a risk-based approach to assessing the quality of evidence. And really what we're talking about is sufficiency and appropriateness. Sufficiency as a measure is how much is enough, and appropriateness is a measure of the quality. Things like, is it relevant? And we'll get into those terms in a little bit. But as for GAO, GAO is the one who writes these auditing standards, and it is the premier agency for the world. The rest of the world follows the Government Accountability Office standards. And GAO is a nonpartisan investigative arm of the Congress. So I've worked for GAO since 1988. As Mari said, I'm a senior energy analyst. My specialty is in nuclear energy. And I am an adjunct faculty at GAO, and I teach evidence among other things. I was an apprentice in 2020 and certified as a Master Gardener in 2020 as well. So the world around us is full of fiction and fact, and you can find it all on the internet. So why should we assess the quality of information before we report it? Please use the chat box and give your ideas, give your thoughts. Why is it important to assess the quality of information?
And you can also unmute yourself if you like as well.
Oh, if you have the capability to unmute yourself, please do that. That's probably, there's only a couple of us, so unmute yourself and you can say what you think. Hearing none, I will just go on. So it's important to assess the quality of information because we use information to guide our decisions and to share with others to help them guide their decisions. So good quality information contributes to informed decisions, and that we hope leads to a desired outcome. On the other hand, poor quality information can contribute to misinformed conditions or information and lead to not such a desired outcome. Knowing how to assess the quality information can lead to more desired outcomes. And that's what we're really working at here as Colorado Master Gardeners. Limiting your research to known quality sources like Cite.edu reduces your risk of providing information. But as we'll see, even Cite.edu has its limitations. And this is going to sort of hopefully give you a sense of how to gauge and assess the quality of information based on its source.
And
So
Ruth
we use
also
an evidence.
mentioned, sorry, Robert, Ruth mentioned that the information could be harmful if it's not correct. So if we give
Absolutely.
wrong information, it could be harmful for the community as well. So that's a
Yeah,
good
Ruth,
point.
thanks for sharing, Ruth. Yeah, absolutely. And as Master Gardeners, we're in the business of providing information. Providing misinformation can be extremely harmful, and worse, could ruin our reputation. If we lose our credibility, there's no reason for us to exist, and that would be awful. So we do need to maintain that. So this is an evidence model, and it consists of 4 parts. It begins with the question, and the question is basically, what is it you want to answer? And then the second part is there evidence available to answer your question? If not, you cannot answer that question without revising the question. A good example might be if the question asks something about medicinal properties of a plant, which we cannot address. So we have to ask a different question. We cannot answer that one. Then the next step is assessing the quality of evidence. Is the evidence sufficient, and is it appropriate to answer the question? Again, it's a measure of the sufficiency and quality of evidence. Then the last part is reporting of the evidence. Can we report the evidence without limitations? Or if there's some limitation, how do we report that information? And we'll cover exactly how we do that in this course. So looking just at the basics of applying the evidence model, let's look at a couple of examples. So what question am I trying to answer? Let's ask, why is grass green? So you look at the evidence to answer the question, and you have different sources. You have things like testimonial evidence. You go to other master gardeners. You have documentary evidence. You could go to extension documents, or you have electronic evidence, and that would be the internet. And then you have to assess the quality of the evidence. You might ask a question like, do sources corroborate or contradict each other? Is there enough evidence to be convincing? Is it valid and relevant? And the last step in the model would be to report the evidence. And you might ask, do I have to limit my answer based on the quality of evidence? So we're going to go through the evidence model in the next steps. But let's look first at the standards of evidence, sufficiency and appropriateness. So as I mentioned, sufficiency is a measure of the quantity of evidence, and how much is enough is going to depend on the appropriateness of evidence. The basic standard is to decide if you have enough evidence that you can persuade a knowledgeable but independent person that your evidence is reasonable. That would be how much. That's when you can stop collecting evidence. The appropriateness of evidence is a measure of the quality of evidence. That would be relevancy, validity, and reliability. Relevancy gets to logic. Is there a logical relationship to your question? Validity is, does it make sense based on sound reasoning? And reliability is consistency and completeness. You have to make sure the data is as complete as necessary to meet the standards. So applying the evidence model to the standards, and we're looking here first at testimonial evidence and documentary evidence. That would be testimonial would be talking to other master gardeners, or documentary would be looking at extension documents. You want to start off with, again, the question you're trying to answer and looking at the reliability of your sources. One of the things you want to know is the transparency of your source. So you want to know, and transparency is a measure of how you know the source is valid and reliable. So for example, a Colorado Master Gardener, you would know is transparent by what level of knowledge they have. Are they a staff member, or do they have a degree in horticulture, or are they an apprentice? That would make a difference, but you know that. You know that, so you would know, so you would be able to say, I would probably put more reliability in a horticultural, somebody with the degree in horticulture than I would with an apprentice. In this case, in every case actually, personal judgment is required. Let's look at the strengths and limitations of testimonial and documentary evidence. Looking first at testimonial evidence, that is talking to other master gardeners, the strengths are it's easily accessible. If you're in the office answering questions, there's somebody next to you, or you have staff members that are available. They're very easily accessible. They're credible and authoritative. And you can ask clarifying questions. You can, if you don't understand, you can follow up with another question and get more information. And there's multiple sources for cooperation. There's more than one person in the office. Or if you have phone calls, you can even email some of the master gardeners. So there's lots of choices for that. But there's also limitations in talking to master gardeners. That is, rely on the accuracy of their memory. Maybe you don't remember exactly the way it should be. You cannot test for accuracy. If they tell you something wrong, how do you know it's wrong? And then consistency or completeness of information may vary from master gardener to master gardener. One master gardener may think something is more important than another and provide more complete information on one aspect of your question and less complete information on another part of your question. How do you know that? So in terms of documentary evidence, let's look at the strengths and weaknesses. And these are, again, extension type documents. They're vetted and they're fact checked. You know that. You can trust them. They're credible and they're authoritative. And they're consistent and you know they're likely to be complete. They're not going to leave information out. In fact, they probably have too much information to answer your question. That's okay. You could just pick and choose what you need from the documents. But like with testimonial evidence, there's also limitations. You cannot ask a document clarifying questions. Documents may not be readily available. And it may take time to go through a document to find the information that you're looking for. So let's look at the evidence model as you apply it to web-based information. Again, you start off with a question and you look at the reliability of your sources. As with the testimonial and documentary evidence, for higher risk questions, you might want more rigor in your research. And we'll go over that in a little bit. Again, transparency is going to be key to knowing how valid and reliable is your source of information. However, on the internet, it's a little bit more difficult for you to gauge the transparency or the reliability and validity of your information. You can use Cite.edu, which probably gives you more confidence in the search results, but it's not foolproof. You might not get the best quality of information just by using Cite.edu. There will have to be some sort of assessment of the quality of evidence. And we're going to cover that now. But let me ask you first, what do you think might be some strengths and limitations of web-based evidence? Just like there were strengths and limitations of testimonial evidence and documentary evidence, what do you think might apply as strengths and limitations to web-based information? You can unmute your phone or type something in the chat box. What do you think?
I guess one big limitation I will say will be that there is a lot of information on the web, so you don't know which one you will trust compared to the testimonial or the evidence base. You at least will know that the person will know more, or you found it on a book, for example. But on the web, how do you know which one is good and which one is bad? Will be a big limitation.
That's a really good point, Mari. And in fact, with testimonial evidence, talking with somebody, you can even ask them, what source would you recommend that I go to? So you could ask those kinds of things, and that could be very, very helpful. Let's look at the strengths and limitations of web-based evidence. Strengths are, it's easily accessible, if you've got a computer, that is. It's searchable for credible and authoritative sites, if you know how to find them. And you can seek clarifying information. You can type in all sorts of questions into the internet, just as if you would ask a question of a person standing next to you. And there's multiple sources for corroboration, but there are also limitations. The transparency is not always available. That is, you don't always know how the evidence was collected, assessed, and reported. That's a big problem. Misinformation, we know, is rampant on the internet. It may take time to find specific information, particularly on hard to find topics. And you may not be able to ascertain completeness. That is, how do you know you have all the facts to assess the quality of evidence? That's also a big question. So studies have shown that using the standards of evidence, you can conduct research on the internet and come up with the correct answer, correct information. But it depends on how you conduct that research and how you assess your information against the standards of evidence. So this is the model that we use to look at the quality of evidence. On the left-hand side is your source, your web-based source. So the pyramid represents your trust, your level of trust. At the very top would be your highest level of trust. You have a great deal of trust, but it's small at the top of the pyramid because there's very few sources on the internet that you trust fully. But for those, there's full transparency. You know the source of the evidence, you know how the evidence was collected, and you know how that source reports it. So you have a lot of confidence that you can trust that source. Then as you go down the pyramid, you have medium risk sources. There's some transparency. You trust some content. You know a little bit about the source of evidence, but not a lot. So you may not trust it a lot, but you trust it more than you might other places. At the very bottom, and this is where you're going to find most sources on the internet, a lot of websites are going to have no transparency, and you're going to trust those sources very little. On the right-hand side of the pyramid is your level of risk. This is based on the question. So you want to use for the high-risk questions, the ones that could damage landscape if you provide information, you want to limit those to the low-risk sources or the sources you trust the most. The ones that are medium risk sources, for example, identification of a plant, you can use a lot more sources on the internet. You don't always have to go to Cite.edu. A lot of nurseries or the Native Plant Society or other places can also easily correctly identify a plant. And then for low risk sources, things like grass is green, you don't want to have any question that would cause a risk to your client, the person you're asking or answering a question for, because you know very little about that. So are there any questions on the pyramid? Now let's go back to the pyramid. Any questions on the pyramid or on the models that we've talked about so far? Okay, hearing none, we'll just move on to the next one. So just a recap of the risk-based research. So the risk of the question is going to determine the rigor of your research. That is, higher risk questions are going to tell you, I need to probably do a little bit more research than I do for, say, the grass is green. I don't need to do much research for that. And if you start off with a master gardener and they don't know the answer or only can provide part of the answer, well then based on the degree of risk, you might want to talk to another master gardener, someone with more appropriate knowledge about the question you're trying to answer. Same thing with documentary evidence. If one document is not sufficient, maybe you need to open up another one and find other sources, other documents to answer the question. Again, it depends on the degree of rigor of the question. How much research do you need to do to answer the question and still feel confident that you've met the standards of evidence, that is, it's sufficient and appropriate. Sometimes you'll need to use multiple sources of evidence. We call that corroboration. And this is when you may have areas of uncertainty. You may want to have multiple sources to corroborate your evidence. So every case is going to be different. You use your personal judgment and critical thinking to determine when you have met the standards of evidence to answer a question. So if you excuse me a second, I'm just going to close the door because I've got some noise going on outside. Okay, so one more note about risk-based research as well. Critical thinking is going to be required because, as we know, Most people fail to use risk-based research or critical thinking in their web-based research. You probably have seen this in studies, and I've seen lots of studies as well, that people just don't follow risk-based kind of research, often don't use things like we know about, Cite EDU, which can provide more confidence in your research. Also, search engines favor certain results. That is, they're often based on keywords that corporations have developed to ensure their websites come up first or come up more often. And so you may be fooled by keywords because it's easy. It's what corporations are paid for. And that doesn't always land you with the best results. And then finally, web-based researchers can improve the quality of results by identifying patterns of results linked to certain keywords. There was a study done by Yale University a few years ago that asked participants to find information on the internet. And almost all of them failed to find the correct information on the internet. And the Yale University looked at the reasons why. Turns out there was one category of people that did find the correct evidence 100% of the time, and they were trained fact checkers. What the trained fact checkers did is they actually looked for patterns among the keywords, and they were able to identify which ones were going to provide the correct information and which one were not by following the information that followed the keywords. Simple things like this can help us find accurate information on the internet. So we're going to use case studies to apply the evidence model. We'll go through 2 different case studies. We're going to be, now your evidence that it's available to you as a master gardener are other master gardeners, that is testimonial evidence, documentation, so documentary evidence, and the internet. And we're going to focus, because this is a course on risk-based search on the internet, we're going to focus on web-based searches. But this is a training session, so it is always okay to say we do not know the answer, or we can get back to the caller at a later date. Now, for full transparency, all the research that I did for these case studies was conducted between December 2020 through February 2021. So the first case study is the emerald ash borer. And we're going to assume we're going to have a call to the help desk. And the call is something that you might get. So it's a real valid case. The call might be something like, I have ash trees and I am concerned about the emerald ash borer, which has been reported in the state. I have heard that an infestation of emerald ash borers is always fatal to a tree, and that once an infestation starts, it is impossible to curtail it in time to save the tree. I don't want to lose my ash trees. How do I protect my tree from an infestation of the emerald ash borer and save my ash trees? So using the evidence model, where do we start? Well, we start with the pyramid. We're gonna do a poll, and I'm gonna ask you to tell me based on the question, is the question low risk, medium risk, or high risk? What do you think?
And you can just select one of the options.
Okay, we have one response, and I will go ahead and end the poll. And it is a medium risk on the answer for that. Can you all see the results of the poll? Okay, good. So medium risk. So let's take a look at that. Can you take the poll away now, Mari? Or do I do that?
I did it.
Okay. Did you take it away?
Yes.
Okay, so I can go on?
Yeah.
Okay. Oops, I can't go on. It's not letting me. Maybe I should do this. Let me do. Okay, I think now. Okay. It's not letting me go forward. Let's see. There we go. Okay. So using the evidence model, the question we're trying to answer, how do I protect my ash trees from the emerald ash borer, I think would be a high risk question, because the risk of providing misinformation may cause the loss of ash trees. That is, if we're wrong or we provide something that's erroneous, it could cause the loss of a valuable commodity to the caller. We may want to clarify with the caller the amount of time and resources that may be needed to save the high value ash trees. That is, how much time and resources do they have? Pre-treatment of ash trees can be a costly multi-year effort. We want to know if the caller is willing to go through with that. And then there are potential adverse effects of pre-treatment on other organisms and on tree survival. So we want to cover that with them as well. But let's continue on with the evidence model. So we want to look at the question, how do I protect my ash trees from the emerald ash borer? And I used first an unrefined search term. Just entered it in the internet and hit search. And I came up with a bunch of different sites. So I'm going to cover industry sites first, and I summarize the results. So in the first industry sites, they came up with several different, you can see them. Treatment is a homeowner's choice based on the value of the tree. Pre-treatment as soon as the emerald ash borer is detected nearby. Waiting on treatment until infestation is expected in the current growing season. It's all over the board. So the results are not consistent enough to meet the evidence standards of sufficiency or appropriateness. I can't tell from industry's position what to do or what to tell the caller. So I've also got summarized results from state and local government. They're mostly agnostic to pre-treatment. They just provided information and they stressed other mitigation efforts. Well, that's not of much use to me in terms of answering the question, because they didn't answer the question I'm interested in. So they didn't meet the standards of sufficiency and appropriateness. So I also got education sites on a general search term, and I got all sorts of general information as well. Nothing that was very helpful or useful in answering the question in terms of meeting the standards of sufficiency and appropriateness. I did find that there were other mitigation efforts that I could do, like limiting firewood, movement, removal of ash trees, or planting other species. That's helpful, but it doesn't answer the caller's question. So I need to refine my search. So I can use the site edu, which we've all been taught to do as master gardeners. And I found different results, and I've summarized them below. And I got a variance in pre-treatment. When should I pre-treat? A bunch of sites said I should pre-treat when an infestation is within 15 miles. A bunch of other sites said I should pre-treat when an infestation is expected to occur in this growing season. Okay, that's not very helpful. I can't answer a question with that. And then the same thing with canopy thinning. I got variance in the same line. How long should I treat? In this particular case, I got a bunch of sites that said I should treat until I've lost 50% of the canopy. A bunch of other sites said I should treat until I've lost 30 to 50% of the canopy. And I know I have to treat until the emerald ash borer, as long as the emerald ash borer is present. So I have conflicting information here, even though I've used the site edu. I can't answer the question with meeting the standards of sufficiency and appropriateness for the caller. It makes a big difference if the caller is going to start when the infestation is 15 miles away, or if an infestation is going to occur this growing season. Because if it's 15 miles away, it may take another year or two or more to reach me or reach the caller. And it could be very expensive if you have to treat for several years before you have to. And that's why we want to know how much is a caller willing to pay. One thing I've noticed, though, is doing site edu doesn't separate out the results by date. So I got results spanning from 2013 to 2020. So I'm thinking that some of those sites may not have current evidence reported in them. So there's a questions on the current reliability of the evidence using site edu. But I noticed something else, that Whitney Cranshaw, who I know is a CSU entomologist, appeared as a contributor to many studies. This is going to provide me with another source of evidence. So now, since I cannot answer the question based on using the search term with the refinement site edu, I'm now going to use the search term. Before that, I've got a slide here. We just covered that same kind of thing about the variances. I covered that already. So I'm going to use a search term now using Whitney Cranshaw as a search term. And I want to know when do I begin pretreatment, and how long can I pretreat for based on thinning of the canopy? And this is going to tell me CSU specific information. The results were, and I've summarized them below. It turns out he's the author and presenter of evidence provided to local and regional governments. So that tells me he's trusted as an authoritative primary source of information. And he recommended wait until the emerald ash borer infestation is expected to occur during the current growing season. And he also recommended to treat the tree until the tree has lost 30 to 50% of its canopy. I now know that I have the most up-to-date information from CSU, and I can answer the question that the caller had. But I want to do one more thing, just to make sure. I'm going to corroborate my results. I'm going to collect testimonial evidence from Lisa Mason, who's an entomologist and the horticulture agent in Arapahoe County. And she confirmed that the Colorado Emerald Ash Borer Response Interagency Team decided not to use a specific mile radius in Colorado, so pretreatment is left up to the homeowner, but need not begin until an infestation is expected to begin that current growing season. I know that is the most recent up-to-date information. But Lisa Mason also provided some more information that's helpful to the caller, that maybe we need to provide, advise the caller to have proper identification of the emerald ash borer, because not all wood borers are fatal to ash trees. That's helpful information to know. So now I come to the reporting of the evidence, which again, as you remember, is the last stage of the evidence model. So I can report that pre-treating ash trees can save the ash trees, but I can qualify it that I have the most current and authoritative information. The survivability of ash trees is you should continue treating until 30% to 50% of canopy thinning, and of course you should begin during the current growing season. You can also report on the other mitigation efforts that we heard about. So now I can answer the question. Any questions on that model before we go on? We have another case study.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes.
How do you contend with unscrupulous contractors who are just out to scare tactics, get homeowners to spend their money, and and it's not necessary or realistic at this time? It's too, I guess, premature, but they want to sell, they want the business.
And if you remember, the very first search term that I used, which is unrefined, and I got the industry, some of them did say begin treating right away. Right. And those would be some of those unscrupulous people. The only way to deal with that really is with information. You have to arm yourself with accurate information. So once you've got the correct steps to go through in terms of satisfying the evidence model and making sure the evidence you have is sufficient and appropriate, you can go to the caller and say, this, the industry can say whatever they want, but this is the information and this is how you need to respond to it. There are unscrupulous people out there, but this is the best information that we have. And that's how we do it. Did that answer your question, Al?
It did, thank you.
Okay. All right, any other questions before I move on? Okay. The next case study deals with oleander. And again, might be a typical call you get at the help desk. I have problems with a neighbor's dog. The fence between our properties is 5 feet tall, as required by the homeowners association, but the dog can jump the fence and it soils my lawn. I do not want to hurt the dog. I thought a tall hedge might work. I heard about a tall hedge that is an evergreen and has beautiful flowers. I think it is called oleander or something. Can oleander grow in Colorado? So where do we start? Well, we start with the evidence model. So let's begin again with that pyramid. And we want to look at the level of risk of the question. Based on the evidence model, what do you think? Is this a low risk, medium risk, or high risk question? And go ahead and click your answer in the poll. Okay. If everybody has done, I'm going to end the poll. And then I'm going to share the results. Hopefully you all can see that. And the answers are low risk. Okay, let's take a look at that. Can you remove the poll? And let's move on and see. There we go. Okay, so the question we're trying to answer is, can oleander be grown in Colorado? So the question does seem to be low risk, because you can use many sources of information to answer this question, including local nurseries, local gardening clubs, that sort of thing. They would all provide information on whether or not it can grow. So we're going to do a general search term: can oleander be grown in Colorado? And in fact, we come up with search terms, and one of them does turn out to be a local nursery. And so we have pretty good information about whether it can be grown. Turns out that oleander is a warm weather plant. It's native to the Mediterranean region. It is drought resistant. It's salt tolerant because it grows on the coast. And it typically grows in the south where temperatures remain above freezing. But there are no impediments to growing it in Colorado. The temperature affects it a little bit. It is an evergreen and does grow up to 15 feet tall, and it does have pretty flowers. So it does meet the caller's needs. It is listed with the hardiness zones of 8 to 11, but it is sold here at local nurseries. So pretty solid information to answer the question for the caller. But the evidence seems to meet standards of appropriateness for relevancy and validity. But there's something that showed up in the search terms about completeness. And that is that in one case, it raised a red flag. The plant may be poisonous. So we kind of wonder now, maybe I don't have complete evidence that I can answer the caller's question. So how do we do this? Does this raise concerns for the caller? And how about us, if we know now that it could potentially be poisonous? So can Colorado Bastard gardeners comment on poisonous plants? Unmute your phones or comment on the chat box. What do you think? Can we comment on poisonous plants?
It's not our job.
That's correct. It is not our job indeed. So we do have in terms of the evidence model, appropriateness for relevance and validity, but not for completeness. We now do another search on SiteEDU, a more refined search, and we find, in fact, a lot of information on oleander being poisonous, and we cannot comment on poisonous plants. So results are summarized using.
Robert, would you also bring in veterinarian, or recommend they contact a veterinarian?
Oh, for the caller?
Yes.
We could, absolutely. But we're going to go forward and find a little bit more information first. And I'm going to show you how then we might be able to, because we want to get to the assessment of evidence, which is part of the standards of the evidence, and then get to the reporting. And then when we report, we'll know how to report it correctly to the caller. Because remember, we have those 4 steps. We have the question, the looking at whether the evidence is available, the assessment of the evidence, and then the reporting. So we'll get to that, but it's a good point. How do we report it? So we know that according to SiteEDU, that Nerium oleander is toxic to animals, including dogs, toxic to livestock, and it's really dangerous. Just breathing in plant particles can cause injury. So I did another search on SiteGov. So you can also do SiteGov in addition to SiteEDU. And I researched NIH, CDC, FDA, other sorts of government agencies, found out that it's really toxic to people and animals by ingestion, inhalation, and just by touching it. And it's been investigated for homicides and suicides. And it can cause adverse to the function of the heart. So we know this is a really not a good plant to have around people and dogs, that sort of thing. So our low risk question has become high risk for reporting. So now we know that the CSU has a policy that we cannot report on poisonous plants because that's a medical issue and raises liabilities. But we do have sufficient and appropriate evidence now. We can answer the caller's question of whether oleander can be grown in Colorado. But now we don't want to just report on whether it can be grown in Colorado, because now we know our reporting is now high risk. So we want to report it with a limitation. So what we can say is, we can say that Miriam oleander can be grown in Colorado, but its growing season is limited because of the cold. So you might have a lot of maintenance on it. There might be a lot of pruning because of branch dieback, but it does meet collar standards of being 15 feet tall and having pretty flowers. But the federal government reports that Miriam oleander is highly toxic to humans and animals. I cannot comment on it. CSU extension policy does not allow CMGs to comment on poisonous plants, but we can advise the caller you might consider conducting additional research on whether Miriam oleander is a suitable plant for the caller's purposes. Because if the caller said in the beginning they don't want to hurt the dog, this very well might end up hurting the dog. So we cannot comment on the poisonousness of the plant other than to say that the caller might want to do additional research because the plant could harm the dog. So again, the risk of question determines the rigor of your research. On this one, it was a low risk question until we began to do more research, and it turned out to be high risk for reporting. So this is one of those things we have to use personal judgment and critical thinking in order to determine whether or not we've met the standards of evidence. Sometimes we have to use multiple sources of evidence, as I did, starting off with a general search term and going to refinement with Cite.edu, and then refinement even further with Cite.gov. So questions. So Al, did that address your particular question on the vet, calling the vet? We advised the caller on what we could do. Did that help out?
Yes, yes, it did.
Okay. So
because it becomes a moral issue. You don't somehow advise the caller that they need to do some research.
Absolutely, it would be, and again, if you provide information, if you provide incomplete information, I should say, to the caller that they didn't know was poisonous and they planted it anyway, and somebody was injured, the dog or children or something, we lose credibility as an institution. And if we lose credibility, people don't trust us anymore. They don't call us, and then we become no longer relevant. And that's bad. We want to make sure we always meet the standards of sufficiency and appropriateness. Sometimes it's as easy as just asking the master gardener next to you. Sometimes it's going to take asking 2 or 3 master gardeners. Sometimes it's going to take going to a book. Sometimes it's going to do search on the internet, but multiple searches on the internet. It's going to depend on the level of risk of the question, but we never want to provide misinformation, because that would risk our credibility. So hopefully this has showed that that we don't, even if we use Cite.edu, Cite.edu does not always provide the most up-to-date and relevant information. We have to have some assessment of the evidence to determine, is this the most appropriate and sufficient evidence? We've also showed that sometimes the level of risk of the question may be something we understand at first, but the reporting of the question may be very different from the risk of the question itself. And that's where the research comes in and the assessment comes in. So
Robert,
questions on this?
Would it violate CSU policy if you two were to recommend to the caller that you really should call the Poison Control Center and get their assessment of the plant?
I think if you refer another source of information to the caller, that's fine, because you're not advising the caller on the medicinal properties of the plant. If you said, you should grow this or not grow this because it's poisonous, that'd be one thing. But if you're saying you should do more research, call the Poison Center, call your vet. That's fine, because you're not commenting on the poisonous properties of the plant. You're advising the caller, hey, I know something about this plant that you probably want to do more research about. And that's well within, and it preserves our reputation.
Right.
Yeah. Any other questions? I think we finished early because it's a small class, which is fine. But if you'd like to discuss any of the other things we've covered in this on the standards, we can do that, or we can end the class early.
Can I ask you a personal question?
Absolutely.
In your travels in GAO, did you ever run across a Butch Hinton?
A what?
Butch Hinton?
Well, yes. Do you know Butch Hinton?
We've been friends for many years.
Oh, interesting. I know the name. I don't know personally, but yeah.
He was a number one, number two, number three in the hierarchy.
Yes. Well, he was acting Comptroller General for a little while.
Yeah.
And his son is actually with the agency now. Yeah, he was acting. He was never Comptroller General, but acting for a period of time. We went through, I don't know, several months where we were without a Comptroller General. Comptroller General is appointed for a 15-year term, so it's nonpartisan, non-political.
Right.
And it's chosen from the House provides a list of names to the president. The president provides a referral to the Senate, and the Senate confirms for a 15-year time period. So yeah, Butch Hinton was never Comptroller General, so he was never confirmed, but served in that position for a period of months. Interesting, a small world.
It is very small.
Well, thank you all for coming. And if you have any questions or comments, please email us or email directly Robert, and we'll be able to answer it. But other than that, I really appreciate that you'll all be here and that we'll learn a lot. So Robert, thank you for preparing the presentation and also delivering it. I really appreciate it.
Good deal. Good gardening.
Yes, good gardening. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.